This meeting to order this morning, and I'd like to TNRD acknowledges that we are connected with many First Nations communities across our vast regional district, and today we are located in the Swepnock, I may get that right one of these days, territory situated within the unceded ancestral lands of the Swepnock Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with the Swepnock and respect the territory and land upon which we gather today. Okay, any additions or deletions to the agenda? Okay, next on the minutes. We need a recommendation for any errors or omissions. Second, okay, all in favor? Motion's carried. Okay, and then we have delegations. As I turn that over to you, Jamie.
Sure, thank you, Chair. Yeah, the delegation is joining us online. It's from the Bonaparte Watershed Stewardship Society, and the organizational strategy consultant is joining us to present about their organization.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Perfect. We can hear you, and I think you're going to share screen. Is that correct?
I am. The Bonaparte Watershed Stewardship Society, we would like to just say thanks for inviting us. Tricia has been an amazing advocate and really involved, and we just want to say thank you to her for all her support and just her time and who she is as a person. Her authenticity is just really welcomed in this really rural area, and her consideration of all the effects of all the wildfires and emergencies that have gone on are just so much appreciated. We have done a lot of work with the Bonaparte Watershed over the years, along with Bonaparte First Nation. The watershed is around 500,000 hectares, and you can see at the top here, on the center of the screen, you can see Bonaparte Provincial Park. Just north of that is Bonaparte Lake, and the watershed is included in that pink area just around Bonaparte Lake, follows that blue line, and it travels through several lakes. Loon Lake is in there towards the bottom, and then you can see Ashcroft towards the west of Kamloops there, west of Kamloops Lake. So the Bonaparte watershed covers that entire pink area, all in here. All of that water eventually goes into the Thompson, just in Ashcroft here. And this is thanks to Bonaparte First Nation and the Swetnock Fisheries Commission. And the Bonaparte watershed exists in electoral areas A, E, I, J, and O, and also extends into the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District as well. So it covers quite a large area, and it encapsulates so many stakeholders. This is an example of how many creeks and waterways there are in the watershed. In 2017, the Elephant Hill fire took this entire area that's in the red area completely out, and the entire village of Cache Creek was evacuated for some time. Many people lost their homes. There are many elders of the Bonaparte First Nation that are still not returned to their communities just due to lack of reconstruction. Also due to just the repetition of emergencies, floods, and fires in the area. The residents in this area are typically evacuated almost annually due to floods in this area. So it's very difficult to rebuild from all the devastation that's happening there. This is an example of what the watershed looks like after the forest fire. So you can see the deep ravines there. The plantings that you see up on the top of the screen here have been planted since the forest fire, and Ministry of Forests has said it's very difficult for the plantings to take root here just because of the level of erosion that's occurred in this area following the forest fires, and then with obviously rain events and high temperatures as well. And this is another picture as well. So, excuse me. These areas have been replanted largely by Bonaparte First Nation, and the concern is that there is no water retention systems anywhere in this watershed. And there are some in the larger Bonaparte watershed, but there are areas that just don't have them anymore. they've been dismantled, they've eroded, they've disappeared. So for wildfire prevention or for wildfire fighting, there's not as much water anymore. There's not enough water to continue the reforestation efforts. Water doesn't just slowly drain anymore. It just rips out of this area and erodes everything around it. So you can see the upper right-hand photo shows erosion along the creek bank in 2003. And Bonaparte Watershed Stewardship Society worked with Pacific Salmon Foundation. And in 2007, you can see what it looked like after. So BWSS has completed over $750,000 worth of repairing and stream bank restoration since the year 2000. And over 130 salmon habitats. They've completed a water management plan, have done so much community engagement, and have over 200 partners and contacts within the area, stakeholders as well. And they're interested in continuing this work. And they've experienced some very extreme barriers towards doing this work just due to the complexity of the nature of the work and the permitting involved, having stakeholders all agree on how they're going to proceed with things, as well as the cost, obviously. They're a very small nonprofit working in a very large area with a lot of people, and the funding just has not been acquired by the society. So this is from their water management plan, which was done in 2008. You can see that they would want to take a community-based watershed approach, including everybody. I bet that's Al in the lower left-hand side on the table there, speaking before everybody in front of a community hall. That document is available online if anyone wishes to use it. We have a website up with all the resources as well. So this is the mission on the left-hand side. I'm not going to read all of it. Basically, it's to protect the ecosystem of the Bonaparte watershed, stabilize against erosion and flooding, prevent forest fires, floods, droughts, landslides, and restore nature to the best of the ability that we have to do. Just to promote resilience for economic interest, human survival, protect species at risk, work with the salmon and First Nations to restore the lands. So some examples of steps required for restoration are on the left side, and examples barriers are on the right side. So you can see they're about equal. And these are just examples. And there are dozens of steps required before restoration work can complete. For example, to do in-stream works, one has to gain permission from the property owner to do an assessment. Then there has to be a Section 11 application applied for. And that process is quite extensive and can be quite lengthy as well. It involves the Ministry of Forests as well as the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for permitting only. And sometimes those stakeholders within that watershed, say in Cache Creek, for example, there are 20 different interests in there. There's oil and gas. Excuse me, I'm not sure why I'm coughing this morning. There's oil and gas, there's forests, there's First Nations, there's archaeology. There is the Water Sustainability Act, obviously. There are species at risk in that watershed as well. But we have to talk to every single one of those people and say, what projects are you working on here? What's your end goal? How can we work together? What are the interests of everybody that's coming to the table, and how do we do this appropriately? Historically, we've just addressed emergencies as they've happened rather than going to the root, the headwaters, if you will, of the issue and putting in prevention measures such as water retention methods. So these are some of the stakeholders in the watershed. We have multiple ministries of the province, multiple ministries of the federal government. We have the TNRD, obviously. We have Sewetmik, and I'm not sure how to say that one, so I'm on board with you. The NNTC Council nations, as well as independent nations. Multiple municipalities, cattle ranchers, agricultural uses, woodlot users, mining. We've got rail, we've got landholders, and nonprofits as well. So as you can see, these are all the organizations that are needed to come together to affect positively issues in the watershed to prevent flooding, wildfire, land erosions, etc. Our current and past funders for BWSS are on the right side. Currently, we're working with BC Rural Centre, and we're actually providing panelist discussion, I guess you could say, with our geomorphologist. And in Kelowna at the end of the month. So if you'd like to attend their Keeping It Rural conference, we'll be discussing in depth the issues of stream erosion, watershed protection, lands restoration, and the issues around riparian restoration as well. And we're working with BC Wildlife Federation, Bonaparte First Nation, and you can read the list there. We also have a list on the website as well. We're gaining incredibly valuable partnerships, and we're looking to do big things in the watershed towards preventing these kinds of emergencies from happening in the first place. These are all the legislations that are active in the watershed. So these are all the legislations that we read and we refer to, and that our partners read and refer to. And sometimes the legislations, being as old as they aren't accurate and aren't, well, not, I don't want to say accurate, they're not easy to work with in 2024 when they were written in the 1800s or the early 1900s, and the issues that exist today just didn't exist then. Or, you know, settler immigrants were not aware of the complexity of the areas that they were stepping into and the effects that their footprints were going to have on the area. These are all of the legislations that apply within every single watershed in BC, not just the Bonaparte watershed, but these also exist in the Bonaparte watershed as well. So the comments that we've had from a lot of residents, businesses, agricultural users, even politicians is, well, why doesn't somebody do something about it? It's because it's not just one person. So for example, the TNRD might not have jurisdiction in a provincial park or in Crown land, and a municipality might not have jurisdiction outside of their area, even though those people live and their mailing address might be, say, Cache Creek, BC. The municipality's jurisdiction ends at a certain line. TNRD has a certain jurisdiction, and then they all have their own mandates, of course. And emergency prevention so far isn't a mandate outside of their own jurisdictions. So what BWSS is proposing to do is to act as a wheelhouse, if you will, of a place for all of these organizations to gather together and openly discuss on the table without those barriers in place, without the barrier of a mandate or a jurisdiction. Because we still understand that the regional district, the province, different municipalities have their own jurisdictions and have to act within their own mandates. So if they're willing to do that and they're coming to the table and they're saying, yes, we want to prevent these emergencies from happening, we're able to connect all of the other missing pieces. Pull someone from TNRD, pull someone from the village of Cache Creek, from the village of Clinton, from the village of Ashcroft, from each First Nation, and say, how are we going to work together to protect the life, well-being, and safety of our residents? And not just residents, but economy, agricultural lands, even the health and safety of wildfire fighters in super rural areas. How do they gain water access? How do they stay safe in these incredibly dangerous situations? So BWSS is proposing to act as a bridging organization where all the interests are considered, and to also advocate for expediting permitting and licensing, and also to just support residents or landholders that are experiencing extreme distress and are completely overwhelmed by the processes of permitting or legislation, or they're just tired from the constant emergencies that have been occurring, natural disasters, wildfires, floods over the last 10 years, especially in this area. And BWSS is also proposing to determine the ownership, risk, management, and succession of each project within the watershed, and to create plans and work with all stakeholders, track and report as well. These are some similar projects in BC on the left-hand side and how they're funded on the right. So we have Fraser Basin Council, which I'm sure you're all very well aware of. The Thompson-Nicola Conservation Collective is another great initiative with the Grasslands Conservation Council. I love their website and their material. It is fantastic. And for BWSS to be able to provide something like they have provided would be phenomenal. And we believe, and many of our stakeholders and our funders also believe, and this is part of why they're coming on board so fast, is because we believe that we can make a manual, if you will, of how this works, how to do it expeditiously, how to do it respectfully, how to do it economically, and how to prove concept of cost and benefit, as well as appropriate risk analysis and reporting, especially for research purposes. These kinds of projects have not typically been done historically in BC or in Canada. They are being done in Europe, and they're actively being done in the US as well. And other countries also have different ways of protecting their wildlife and their ecosystems, because they understand that the human survival is intrinsically tied to the survival of an ecosystem and to access to water, to food, to wildlands. And so we're trying to gain basically we're trying to educate so that everyone is on the same page and understands that there is a very intensive process that must be followed. And sometimes that process works against us in order to restore what is needed to be restored. And so if we can put that on paper and show people these are the steps, that becomes much easier for people to follow those steps. If we can put that in documents and track those and report on those, that's what we're looking to do. How these different alliances and councils are funded is usually through collaborative funding from regional districts, from province, from the Crown, from different MPOs and NGOs. So we're seeking different funding for these as well. We've applied for grants and have active memberships. You can see the 2 to 5 year renewal period is pretty common for these projects. And so we're suggesting something similar. So I pulled some information about the TNRD, including the electoral areas that are involved in the Bonaparte watershed area A, E, I, J, and O. And the total population there is about 9,000 people, and the land area is about 16,000 square kilometers. It's not a very big area, but as you can see, it makes a huge impact and benefit to the residents that are there. And we have the tourism industry in the TNRD is over $1.4 billion. And the construction industry is over 1.5, forestry is over 1.3. Recreation is the contribution of the TNRD's recreational activities is significant to BC, but we don't really know how much that's worth, because residents don't really report how much they spend on recreational activities, but we do know that 83% of the population in the TNRD uses publicly held lands for recreational purposes. That's a massive amount of people that are accessing these spaces on a regular basis. I was pretty surprised to find that we don't know the annual value of agricultural activities in the TNRD, or mining or rail transportation. Fish and wildlife you could put in with recreation, but it's a little bit different because fish also includes salmon-bearing streams that flow down to the Thompson, that flow down to the Pacific Ocean. So there's not really a huge way to track that. An old saying that came to mind yesterday as I was thinking about this is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So BWSS is seeking to prevent these natural disasters. And you can see the last line on this chart is disasters and emergencies. The province of BC has proposed a $405 million budget for emergency response, etc. this year. That's a massive amount of money. So say there's 16 ounces in a pound, divide 405 by 16, and you've got some millions of dollars, but not $405 million. So in an emergency, or a state of a local emergency, or say wildfire shuts down a town or a highway, or a landslide shuts down a highway, your tourism is affected, your rail and transportation are affected. They're not only shut down, they're damaged. So you have the cost of the shutdown, you have the cost of the damage, you have the cost of the reparation and the restoration. So if we can prevent that from happening in the first place, we don't have to spend $405 million on emergency response. We can spend $20 million doing the restoration work and preventing these from happening in the first place. So BWSS has applied with REFBC for $150,000 for a 2-year pilot project of completing restoration works in the upper watersheds. So upper watersheds, again, are Crown land, parkland. So that's the Crown, the province, also involved First Nations, the TNRD, if that's applicable, as well as the stakeholders. Often there's ranch leases in those areas as well. So first step, we have to perform land assessments, and we have partners available to do that with us. And we are proposing plans and creating a template that will be based off of what the US and Europe uses as well, and we'll be presenting that as an option and working with that to line up with legislation and the steps that permitters are requiring organizations or landholders to follow. But further funding would allow BWSS to engage these stakeholders, have meaningful conversations with them in a timely and efficient manner. Currently, everyone that's involved with BWSS, including myself, are volunteers, and we're spending quite a lot of time on this. The amount of panicked phone calls and emails that we get saying, my farm's going to disappear this year if freshet is severe. If we have a wildfire, I'm going to have to move. I can't take it again. We have businesses that are closed 3 to 6 months almost on an annual basis due to wildfires, smoke, or floods. And small communities in the TNRD just can't afford that anymore. And I mean, maybe they couldn't afford it ever. I don't think they would have signed up for it if they knew it were going to happen. And that's another aspect of it too, is the mental health and how it's affecting business owners, immigrants that are purchasing these businesses and coming to Canada. And farm owners who are working full-time, working with one farm. They both work for the provincial government, and they can't restore their farm the way that they would like to. So they know the process. They understand how restoration and land protection and restoring land, permitting, etc. They understand the process of how it works. They just can't get there because they're so overwhelmed. It happens every year. They're exhausted by it. And so BWSS would like to support these landholders with these restorations, just to restore their own mental health, restore their own sense of safety, restore their trust in the community, and restore their trust in some kind of process that doesn't make them feel like they're going to have to just lose everything all over again every year and keep experiencing this. We're also working closely with DFO and MOF concerning permitting applications, and we do have some active Section 11 permit applications in currently. We just held on May 4 a beaver dam analog workshop up in the upper Venables Creek watershed, which is just on the farthest west and almost southern side of the Bonaparte watershed, just west of Ashcroft. Jeff Anderson is a PhD candidate and geomorphologist from Smithers, and he's come down several times, and he does a fair amount of work in the Bonaparte watershed, the Shuswap watershed, as well as other watersheds in the Thompson-Shuswap Okanagan. And his PhD candidacy is with a university in the US, and their manual is considered the manual, the go-to manual for all restoration projects in watersheds. So we've taken that, and Jeff's adapted it for this workshop to follow permitting requirements. So this was not done inside a stream channel. We do have an application for works inside a stream channel, but as you can see, once this area floods, when the freshet happens, the water will be held in this area and will be available in the dry summer months for firefighting, for agricultural uses, for irrigation, for drinking water, if that's absolutely necessary. And it will prevent erosion from occurring in this area there are pictures just to the side of this picture where erosion has already been occurring, and this is at the headwaters of the Venables Creek. So it's up as far as we can go. Further up the watershed, if you will, of this, it is just bedrock, basalt, and a system such as this wouldn't work any further up the watershed than this. That's one of my favorite pictures in the world. We took a tour with multiple organizations, and this is Bert Williams on the left. He's Bonaparte First Nations chief archaeologist, and Al Midgley, who is the BWSS president and water tech for the TNRD. He's been a water technician for 40 some years. He turns 80 this year, and we're so grateful to have his passion and his just absolute collaborative way of being. He is considered and just so held in honor in the community, and it's been such a privilege working with him. And so we toured the entire Cache Creek watershed with all these different organizations in November 23 and just looked at the effects of the wildfire, where erosion was happening, what farms were at risk, how they were dealing with their own risks, and what we could potentially do to prevent further degradation in the future. And these are the BWS's contact information. And congrats, Al, on your nomination for Land Champion Awards with REFBC. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've done. I see he's joined us here, so I wanted to say thank you to him. And this is the contact information if you'd like more information. I know this is a lot of information really, really fast. So I'm hoping to answer some questions and provide more information if that's needed.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any questions from the directors? Oh yeah. Director Tasso, I see you've joined us from wherever you are.
Yes,
if you have a question, go ahead.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Chair. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the presentation there. I just got one question, or actually, sorry, I got two questions. One is how much consideration is taken into for watershed prevention in your to your knowledge when logging is permitted? Because in Area A, looking around our valleys, I see a lot of logging on slopes. And, you know, just doing some research in the past before my time, I know massive landslides have happened and that closed down Highway 5 in the past back in the 90s and early 2000s. Sorry, that's question one. And second, regarding the funding, I saw one of the funding models is dollar per capita in affected districts. Are you proposing that the TNRD establish a service for the BWSS to be funded by affected electoral areas?
So I'll answer the second question first. That is entirely up to the TNRD. We believe that if the TNRD would like to see these kinds of activities occur within their jurisdictional area, then there's an opportunity for some kind of support or back and forth to happen, whether that's financial or whether that's service provision. For example, DFO is providing biologists, geomorphologists, all kinds of specialty engineers, and they're doing that just as a provision to BWSS just to see these works happen because they understand that BWSS can't afford it and that no one else has a mandate or jurisdiction, say, to do these works. So BWSS does need the funding to complete it, and we also need services. And so there are various ways that different organizations can contribute. Typically, in other areas, the regional district will contribute financially. We understand that that's an extra burden on the taxpayer, but if an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, then maybe we need to focus expenditures on prevention rather than just restoring what's been broken, just waiting for it to be broken again in the following year. So that's entirely up to the TNRD and what the TNRD would like to do. Some communities have set up trusts, so it's an investment structure. That's basically the way that community foundation organizations have typically worked, and they act as a holding cell for finances and then release investment returns to fund different ventures, and that's possible. This isn't a 1 or 2 year project. This is a 10 to 20 to 50 year project. This is going to take some time and some kind of investment. So what that looks like and how fast it goes and how much it moves and what effects it has, those all have to be measured, reported, calibrated. There's a lot of things that are needed first before immediate results can happen. The first question as to logging, that is definitely a concern that people have brought up, is they see all these cut blocks where things are just absolutely cleared and brought to the ground. Even driving around and on Forest Service roads and seeing all the slash piles sitting there and just looking at them and knowing that someone could potentially heat their home for the winter with the wood that is there kind of breaks my heart a little. And I've spoken to a lot of ranchers and they said, well, we'd be more than happy to take that slash pile and put it on our land just to hold water, just to build some sort of system where water can sink into the ground and that woody debris will hold the water and slowly release it over the year. But the permitting is expensive, takes a lot of time, and usually Ministry of Forests just wants to get rid of it before it's a fire risk in August. So there's some processes there that are just, they're not expedient enough for people to lean on them, and we would like to move those, and we would love to not see all these clear cuts happening, and that is where I would refer you to Ministry of Forests to ask that question for sure. That is absolutely a concern that we hear.
Thank you. And yeah, if there's any Area A projects that you're applying for provincial or federal funding, please do get in touch. I would love to give you a letter of support.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Director.
Any other questions from the directors? Sorry, thank you very much for your presentation. I don't know if we have any follow-up to do in this, Jamie?
Not at this time, but I just want to mention that the number of the board of directors from the Stewardship Society have joined us here. So I think they're available if there's any questions for them or to chat with them after the meeting or during the break.
Any questions for the delegation that just came in? One other thing I forgot to do was introduce Renee Elliott, taking our Mike Grenier's chair today. Any of the directors and staff have known Renee for a long time. Anyway, welcome aboard for another exciting TNRD meeting. So I'm not sure is next on the agenda, maybe through to.
Next is 6.1 advocacy topics.
Yeah, okay. And are you who's making the presentation?
Yeah, Corbin is going to lead us.
Okay, Corbin, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think my presentation is going to come up just in a sec. Not that there's much to it, just want to sort of go over a list of topics from last year's UBCM. And the intention of today's sort of presentation and report is to seek committee feedback, specifically around shared advocacy priorities for electoral area directors. Obviously, there's a lot of advocacy that individual directors do on their own that are related to specific issues within each electoral area, but there's also a lot of issues that are shared and areas that there's an opportunity for us to work together on. So You know, certainly looking for some initial direction not direction, initial input from the committee on potential advocacy topics for UBCM to start with. It is 4 months away, but then also beyond UBCM and making sure that we're keeping our advocacy consistent. Really just looking for, you know, sort of those key priorities that, you know, myself and other staff can work with directors to get across the finish line, you know, hopefully by the end of the term. If not, then going into the next term. Obviously, some of these projects are much bigger, but really just looking for those few key topics, and that's not to say that these are going to be the be all end all of advocacy. Obviously, there's a lot of work that each of you do as individual directors for your constituents, but again, these are sort of, you know, topics that we've brought up at UBCM in the past that we know are important. So an example would be small water utility system funding. You know, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs has given an indication that perhaps there might be an availability for a pilot project. So is that something that directors feel is a shared priority that we can advance, and that, you know, directors can work to advocate to politicians, and myself and other members of staff can work to advocate at a staff level with the province for a pilot project, as an example with that one. So really just looking for some feedback. There will be a more formalized report coming to the board this afternoon, specifically around, again, advocacy topics, but that one's looking more so at UBCM because the meeting request portal has now opened, so we're able to request meetings with ministers. So right now, just looking for some initial feedback from the committee, and then this afternoon we'll be going into a more formalized direction from the board for UBCM priorities.
Thank you. Do any directors have any advocacy items? Director Thorpe.
Hi, you got a pen there? All right. I still would like to talk about the evacuation routes again, because I know that we're looking at it from a TNRD point of view, but I think we need to involve Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Forests, and really push that evacuation, the egress routes. There's one. DFA funding to include wildfire in areas where there is no fire department, because I'm talking to residents and I'm finding that they can't get fire insurance if there is no fire department in their area, or they are being put through a number of hoops. And then maybe after they do X, Y, and Z, they might qualify, but it's around the $8,000 mark, which makes it astronomical. So I think that's something we need to look at. BC Building Code. Consideration for those off-grid. I'm finding, talking to residents, that mechanical requirements are not always feasible in an area where we do not have electricity and we're using alternate forms of energy. So one size doesn't fit all. So maybe that's something we need to advocate for as well. Rangelands. This is my last one. I'm talking to residents and we're finding that with the Land Act that some people that have had tenure for over 100 years are now being told that they need to relinquish their rangelands and move elsewhere due to maybe a cultural sensitivity or something. So I'm thinking that maybe this is something we need to look at and see how we can find a balance to protect the ranchers as well, because they're being told that they now have to go to a different area that involves cattle liners, and we're looking at increased costs for small operations. So maybe we can do a bit of give and take there. That's it for now.
Director Huhn.
Thanks, Chair. I think the 6 that you mentioned there in that list, Corbin, are all important in just about every area of all the electoral areas, and then the ones that Tricia brought up today that are pretty close to the heart to her. And, you know, I think we don't want to get too many. I think we're better off with the 6 and the ones that Trish suggested, and concentrate on them and see if we can maybe get 1 or 2 of them done. I mean, yeah. But they're all important in their own way. Thank you.
Director Morris?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Oh, that's too bad for you. Oh dear. So just a few that I had been thinking about. I think that one of the first ones is the ability between regional districts to where we have shared geography essentially and shared issues. So is to look for that way to further formalize. And in my case, obviously, Area P with CSRD would be a critical go forward and advocacy between those. That was one of them. The evac routes have been mentioned and really critical in terms of, again, that shared response because of how we do cross into other regional districts beside us, and critical certainly for Area P, I would ask for. Watershed impacts mitigation. I've got too many great examples of watersheds within Area P that have been impacted by the fire and everything else. So again, keeping that high on the advocacy priority. You know, almost my first year in this role, a geotechnical $25,000, $30,000 bill for a resident at the base of a mountain, as it were. And so we need to keep that, I think, on the forefront. I also wanted to raise on the topic list, and I'm almost done, Corbin, sorry, is one thing that we have run into specifically, which is volunteer firefighters on projects with community associations who strictly need access to liability coverage of some kind tied to the equipment that they themselves are buying, in a sense, in order to do that role. So if we can keep that piece in mind as well. And I guess the final one I've raised in another, I think yesterday. In any case, this is around this this process of unsightly premises and how we notify and how those things are dealt with. And I think we need to rethink those levels of confidentiality that are embedded in the legal approach to this, and where we are making our residents keep some information that they want confidential. So I'll leave that. I mentioned it yesterday as well. And with that, that's the end of my list for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other directors have? Director Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that's coming downstream at this point is the new rules and regulations for Agriculture Land Commission. And there's some big ones coming that is going to deal with certainly most of our areas, because we have ALR land. And I think you really need to keep your eyes open, because there could be some difficulty with the way that they want to build houses, etc., and yet leave a lot of that agricultural land that's of no value to anybody in the agricultural land reserve. So it's a phenomenon coming down. You'll probably have to deal with it at UBCM, but I'd like to put it on your agenda.
Thank you. Any other directors? Director Smith?
Thank you, Chair. Just on that point, I have had a brief discussion with Alex, and he's going to discuss a little bit of the ALR this afternoon, I hope. So there's a lot of confusion out there about what's going to happen and who's going to be affected. So I've asked him for some clarification on that. Thank you.
Director Sal.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sorry, just one sec. Let me open up notes here. Yeah, thank you, Corbin and Scott, for your work. I just wanted to comment that, yeah, we do see results for Highway 5 from all the organization of meetings that you've done with ministers in our board. So I thank you for that. And also, you know, the behind the scenes work with the discussion and creating like a framework for a pilot project for municipal affairs to look at. So that's really appreciated. For Area A, I only have one thing to add. It's just the unofficial fire brigade funding. You know, I think in other areas as well, there's these small communities that can't sustain an official TNRD sanctioned fire department, but there's groups of volunteers who can serve that purpose that is much needed. So maybe, you know, some sort of funding could be advocated for from the province. And lastly, do you propose that we, you know, take a votes before before UBCM to think, you know, how many you think is too many with your current capacity, Corbin? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Director Sao. I mean, really, again, these are supposed to be, you know, shared priorities. And so, you know, appreciating that some of these might be a little more specific. And of course, I'm always happy to help with specific issues within each electoral area. But, you know, again, these are sort of intended to be the larger picture that are shared, and they might be a little more specific for each electoral area, depending on what it might be. But generally speaking, it should be sort of overarching topics. I have a long list of notes, but you know, I think there's 27 directors, 10 electoral areas, so it's hard to try and limit down the advocacy. You know, with my current capacity, you know, I'm fine with the number of priority topics that we had for UBCM last year, and so anticipating something around, you know, the 10 topics-ish. Some are going to be easier to advance, some are going to be harder. But yeah, no, absolutely. Again, you know, this is looking for those shared priorities. And I think, you know, a lot of directors have indicated some shared areas that we can add to the list, and some are more specific that I can follow up with you directly on to work with you as to how that's going to look in your electoral area. So thank you.
Director Hooton.
Thanks. With regards to the Land Commission, Corbin, myself, and Alex, we met with the Assistant Deputy Minister of Agriculture last week up at the Environment Office, and Alex brought a lot of these concerns to do with the ALR to the deputy. We shared quite a few different things, including your small animal acreage evacuation during fires and floods. So we covered quite a few topics in, I think, 45 minutes, and had a really good meeting. And I think one of the most important on that list, at least in most of our areas, is the small water utility funding. I mean, we had a pretty long day that one day, and we had to, you know, increase the rates considerably to sustain them. And I think, you know, we're all in that one together. And I know I've got some heat and flack from a few of them out east of town, but big boy, I think I'll take it. So, but that's a really nice list, and thanks for your work with the deputy and all that. Thank you.
Scott, you have a comment?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Laird. Just from a process standpoint, the more we can bundle things together and understanding exactly what ministry looks after what will be important to make sure that we're very focused on what we're asking for. And also keep in mind, we can ask for a meeting 10 times, but we may not get it. So we'll do our best to try to get the meetings. And I think this afternoon, when the board kind of reviews these, we're going to need to probably prioritize them in a way so that we can really push the top 5 or 10. Say there's a dozen, and maybe we only get 6. Which are those 6? Because I want to make sure there's full alignment around the board table, because we need the best direction we can get from the board so that we can kind of do the work from a staff perspective as well. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you, Director Thorpe.
Question. Given that we're in election year, would we maybe be to our benefit to talk to ministry staff?
We always start with staff. Like, we try to book a meeting once we get that priority list, but there could be meetings where we don't get the meeting with the minister, but we can still try to get a staff meeting. So we'll certainly do that as well. My point was more around minister meetings, but we'll always try to get staff meetings, because for the most part, we don't get no's there. We usually have availability with meeting with staff.
Thank you. Supplement. I'm just thinking that given the minister might change, the staff should stay relatively the same, so it might give us a foot in the door.
Yeah, that's a good strategy for sure, and that's what we'd expect.
Did we get everybody have their opportunity to put forward anything they need to be dealt with? So no other I have a hard time with that word. No other problems in your areas you want to deal with? How's that go? Anyway, okay, I think we've got that covered. I think we'll have a 10-minute break. I'm not sure whether, Tricia, are you going to introduce the group at the back that came in? Do you know?
We certainly can, or they could introduce themselves if they'd like.
Yeah, that would be great.
Would you like it? You just have to come up here so people.
Morning. I understand that I'm Tom Pitt, and I'm one of the original founders of the Bonaparte Watershed Stewardship Society. And I understand that you guys are going to talk about that a little bit this morning. And two things: we founded that in the beginning to protect the farmland that's in the Bonaparte watershed there, but also to try and stabilize things for the sake of the fish. In this day and age, you can't just think about one thing. You have to think about everything, because if we're going to make a go of it in this world, we need all that we can take advantage of. And I've kind of was under the impression that, well, we've actually reached a point now where some of the riprap and that's been done on the river needs some repair, and nobody seems to have any money for it. And it's important. The farmland that's in the lower Bonaparte is good land. Desert Hills uses quite a bit of it. We use some, and further south from us, they use a lot more. And another thing that's going to happen this summer is water. And nobody wants to build a dam where you have a bunch of surface water, but there are things that you could do. And the upper watershed would store a little water here and a little there, and I think it would help. I'm pretty new at coming to a meeting like this, so kind of lost. But I've kind of said what's the reason that I came more than anything. And another thing that I've thought about when it comes to water use, like right now, the way I understand it is that it's first in time, first in right. But when you do that, then you're going to lose a bunch of people. And a really good example of that was over on the Salmon River last fall. There's people that were just shut down. But I've come up with an idea that I think would work. And that is, if you were to take a watershed, like a stream like the Bonaparte, and divide the water users into two groups that were roughly equal, and to say that one group could water in this 12 hours and the other group could water in the other 12 hours, I think a lot of people would find that they actually were getting enough water. I know at home, we're right at 16 Mile, which is north of Cache Creek, just north of Highway 99. And standard run is 8 hours. If we've just taken off a cut of hay, we'll run 10. And I still keep saying we, but there's actually only me left. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to me if you've especially if you've put on fertilizer and then you put on too much water, all you did is wash it down out of sight, or what you put it on to help. it's out of its reach. And I think there's something to be learned there. I need someone to kind of lead me a little bit because it's been a long time since I've been to meetings and that, and I'm getting old. But I think the ideas are right, and I've got lots of experience and I've seen a lot. And maybe for now, that's all that I should say. And maybe later we can say a little more. Somehow we've got to get, everything is so logged. When I first started going out with my dad when I was about 10 or 12, you were riding in country that had never been touched all the time. And now when you go and ride, you're in country that's been logged once or twice. And it makes a lot of difference. But I'm starting to just kind of ramble on, and that's not why everybody's here. But that's basically the thoughts that I wanted to present today. And maybe if somebody's got some questions, I could say a little bit more, but I think I'm just repeating myself now.
Thank you. Is there any questions from the board? Okay, yeah. Doesn't look like I've got any questions, so yes.
My name's Gary Winslow. I'm a resident of Cache Creek. I was born in Ashcroft. I've spent basically my whole life in this area. We spend a lot of time these days, my wife and I, sandbagging riverbanks in and around Cache Creek. It's becoming ridiculous, the amount of damage that's being done downstream of the watersheds. And you spoke about the watersheds being an issue, and the watersheds are an issue everywhere. And one of the things that I find is a lot of people talk about watersheds. They've never actually been in the watershed to see what's going on up there. So what I do is I do a lot of photography, and we were in the watershed above Cache Creek last night. And what I'll do is I'll pass these photos around. This is what the top of the Cache Creek watershed actually looks like. There's a massive amount of clear cutting that has gone on over the years. No, these are actually all different pictures taken from the same area. I can actually pass them that way. That photo is actually what happens up in the watershed when a clear cut is done. And some of these are cuts that were done after the fires. So there were areas that were clear cut, they started to grow back, and then the Elephant Hill fire came through. And what happens is someone made a decision after the last fire to start to do a different kind of clear cut to get rid of all the burned timber. And so what would naturally happen after a forest fire is the burned trees would just drop to the ground. They hold a lot of char. The char actually from the trees absorbs a lot of water. But instead of letting that happen, someone made a decision to actually go in with big machines and chip all the char up. And so it's all gone. And what you get is massive amounts of slopes where the water can just run. And this year, it's not as much of a problem in terms of snowpack, but what we're dealing with now is these rain events where the cell comes in and it dumps a huge amount of water all within a matter of a couple hours. And what ends up happening is the water just runs and it goes down into the through these clear cuts. And one thing that the forest companies are really good at is protecting the roads. So what they do is they put culverts in any place where there's natural drainage. And those culverts are great for protecting roads, but what they won't do is actually slow the water down. They speed it up. And some of the pictures you're seeing now are actually what's down below the culverts. And so as that water speeds up, it's actually taking right from the top of the watershed, it's taking the material away and leaving a few rocks and stuff, but it's getting deeper and it's eroding underneath of where all the clear cut is. And it's getting really bad up there. I don't know that beaver dam analogs or even woodlot analogs, such as what the Blue Earth Farm is doing, is the end all be all, but it's something, because we need to do something. It's getting to the point where when you drive down along the Back Valley Road and see Cache Creek, it's completely destroyed in there because of the amount of water that keeps flowing through that creek when we have one of these events. Somebody in 2023, after the last huge flood, actually went in and started riprapping, and they've riprapped Back Valley Road along Cache Creek all the way past the last ranch. I don't know who did that. Like, it must have cost millions of dollars to have that riprap thrown right into the edges of the creek bed. And as far as I knew, that wasn't even legal for us to do. So someone made a decision somewhere to do this, but that's great to try and hold back a little bit of the water or save a little bit of the stream bed, but it's kind of like closing the gate after the horses are out on the highway. We really need to be protecting those watersheds that are up above us. So if we can put some advocacy towards protecting the watersheds, and it's not just Cache Creek, it's Arrowstone, it's every single watershed in this entire region is under the same threats because we've used the same logging practices over and over and over again. And when we look at the trees that have been planted in there, they're just catching the water that's on the surface. They're not really putting roots down, and you can see that when the wind blows and all these trees have been knocked over because the wind is uprooting the trees because there's no roots left in to go down into the ground to hold the trees in place. And there's with these water events, there's no soil left underneath there either. So that's kind of my take on it, but I just go up and take pictures and see what's going on. So hopefully with some help from you and what we're willing to put into this, we can find some money to fix these issues.
Go with the Director Elliott, and then.
So can you tell me exactly what you plan on putting up in that watershed that Mother Nature can't?
What my take on it, which I am by no means a hydrologist or have any kind of background in this. I'm a pipe fitter that worked 37 years at Highland Valley Copper, and I've seen some destruction of the ground over the years and putting in pipelines, that kind of thing. One of the things that I think would be quite helpful in this regard would be when they go up and do a clear cut in an area, that it should be trenched out a little bit, especially where there's been a forest fire. Just start pushing some of those trees to the ground and filling up these trenches, create small moats that hold water back. And it doesn't have to hold it back a whole bunch. It just has to hold back enough that it starts to go into the ground instead of just taking all of that material. straight down the creek and through places like Cache Creek and destroying people's properties, that kind of thing.
I have watched many years of trees that you think are going to hold back water. Water goes wherever water wants to. The trees do not hold it back. And so if you're going to try and do some watershed management, then I think that at some point you have to look at what's under the ground or where the water has taken everything off, because it takes 50 years to grow a tree. You are not, the way nature is going right now, we're going to lose a lot of land in the watersheds. And there is considerable amount of watersheds within the regional district that are facing the same issue. So I think it's a bigger picture than what just one watershed is. And I think that you have to have the answer for all. And I can tell you Mother Nature doesn't stop just because you think she's going to.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. There is no one single thing that's going to fix everything. It's going to have to be a combination of a lot of things, and probably part of it's going to be luck, because no one knows when those rain events are going to happen. We had Highway 1 closed below Spence's Bridge at least twice last year because of massive mudslides. We've been up in that region above the Soap Lake area, and it's all second and third generation timber that's up in there. And a lot of the practices that we've had over the years in terms of replanting and regeneration, they're obviously not working very well. We have a lot of tree planters right now in Cache Creek because of the fact that it's kind of a central area for a lot of what's going on. And we passed a guy a couple of weeks ago walking on the road in the evening. He was on his phone talking to his boss, telling him that that day he had planted 1,700 trees. So I don't know how fast you can plant a tree, but if you're planting 1,700 in one day, a single person, you're planting them awful close together. It seems kind of like a waste of money to be doing that kind of thing. So there's probably a lot of aspects of this that we have to look at, because you walk into these areas that have been replanted and you can't step without hitting a seedling because they're planted right next to each other and they're all competing. And when you look at some of these woodlots that are around, they need to be thinned out massively. And that's something that they're doing up at Blue Earth Farms, is creating these divots in the ground, and they're actually taking all of the branches and the trees that they're thinning out, dropping them into the ground and creating what my wife does in her garden, which is a hugel bed. And it allows that material to decompose right on the spot. And that way you're getting the benefit of the composting from all of these trees. You're not having to clear them out. You don't have to burn them. They're helping the soil regenerate, and they're also opening up the canopy in the woodlots. So it's looking at all of these different things. None of them is a perfect answer, but we can't just keep standing here going, oh, well, we need to do something and then not really accomplishing anything, because what's been done so far is definitely not working.
Director Hanslow, you have a question?
Thank you very much for this. My question to you, it seems like it's just such a massive issue and people want to do the right thing. How do you go about doing the right thing when it's just, there's so many different pieces to the puzzle that you'd have to put together? So my question is, as a director at the TNRD, if there was one thing that you think would absolutely make a difference to your organization, what would that be so that you can continue doing the work that you're doing? Like what is that one thing that we could possibly help you with?
I would say probably funding for the advocacy part of it, allow us to go in and talk to the different departments and bringing people together. That's something that I'm seeing is a huge issue. Like we were at the Beaver Dam Analog Workshop up in Venables Valley a couple weekends ago. And one of the things I noticed right away is even with that group of people who are all in the same valley, they're all farmers and woodlot holders, that kind of thing. They all had different ideas and they all had different thoughts on the water. Like everybody wants their piece of the pie. And there needs to be conversations where you can sit down with people and go, well, your idea, it has some merit, but have you thought about this and this? And get those conversations happening where everybody is kind of on the same page, because right now you have so many different groups. And one of the things that dismayed me a little at that workshop was there wasn't a single member of a First Nation at that particular workshop. And we're not going to get anywhere without getting some sort of input from our First Nations families that are have been here since time immemorial. The woodlot that they have up at Venables Lake, the manager of that woodlot told me that he has such a hard time because when he tries to get any kind of consensus, his woodlot borders on 13 bands. And trying to get consensus from 2 bands is pretty difficult. 13 is absolutely impossible. So there needs to be a group like the Bonaparte Watershed Society that can actually step in and go, we're just here looking out for the forest and for everybody, not just the logging company, not just the ranchers, not just the farmers. It has to be somebody who's kind of looking out for everybody, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
We have to move on. Thank you very much for your presentation and the discussion. If there's you want to meet with any of them, we're going to have a 10-minute break and then go back into the session. You can go and speak with them before they leave. So we'll have a 10-minute break and come back. Thank you. start it again, if you don't mind. Okay, this is one item that wasn't on our agenda, but Scott and Jamie have a presentation around funding issues for our wildfire protection people.
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, Jamie, I just wanted to lead a discussion about something we talked about at last meeting, and that's how we're going to, I think Director Morris brought it up as well, is how do we fund non-structural training and equipment for some societies and things like that, similar to the presentation that Knutsford provided to us and how they're organizing, because in the past, the TNRD board has decided not to fund anything fire related. So I'm going to let Jamie start the conversation, and then we can see what kind of direction we get from the EA group.
Thanks, Scott and Chair. So yeah, I just have a few slides just to kind of set the stage, and really just want this to be a discussion with this group before we move forward. So just a recap of where we're at. That last year, I'm saying that BC Wildfire set a precedent in the sense that they funded training and contracted with the community-based wildfire response groups. And the Knutsford Community Response Society, which you've heard from, was kind of the first group to do that, but then there was more since. So beginning this winter, Wildfire, give them credit, they were very proactive in funding a pilot program that was initiated early this winter that had, it was a contract with Fraser Basin Council to coordinate with all of these community groups that they were aware of to organize and fund training sessions for S100 and S185s. So we recently got an update about that project. We're not directly involved in that project, but we recently got an update from them that there's 9 community groups who have took advantage of that and either already completed the training or are scheduled to complete the training before the end of June. And one of them was actually hosted in our building here yesterday. The S100, the classroom session was hosted here yesterday, and they're out in the field today. So that's just the list of the groups within the TNRD that are taking advantage of this program. So the way it works is that in the event of a fire, BC Wildfire Service may engage with those local groups as temporary contractors. So when that happens, they're called stat hires, then they're under the direct control, direction and safety program of BC Wildfire Service. So it's completely BC Wildfire show, they're in full control. And that's actually an agreement that these community groups sign on to with BC Wildfire and understanding prior to accepting sort of the training opportunities. So with that, the individuals would be required to have basic safety equipment like steel-toe boots, coveralls, gloves, etc. And any other equipment like skid tanks, vehicles, pumps, hoses, those would all could be used and beneficial to the organizations and communities if they were accessible. So that brings us to, I think, the question that many of you already received is, can the TNRD assist in funding either future training or equipment for these groups, and what does that look like? So currently, there's no mechanism for ongoing funding through any existing service for these groups. Also, our current discretionary policy, or actually we called it the EA grant and aid funding, restricts funding to fire protection organizations. Now, the background of this is that restriction was put in place back in 2017 to limit the TNRD's liability related to independent society-run structural fire departments. So this is where things get a little gray, or I shouldn't say gray, it's actually not gray. We just need to be clear when we're talking about wildfire response and wildfire fighting through BC Wildfire Service versus structural fire protection, completely different situations. However, understandably, local groups want to respond to a fire, whether it's a fire, whether it's a barn, or whether it's a wildfire. So I understand that, but from a legislative point of view and the administrative point of view, we should consider those separately. So anyways, that's just the backstory of why that's still included in our grant and aid policy. Now, this is where we're moving forward on this is we've committed to bring this forward to the entire board with a report, considered options and recommendations at the July 19th committee, the whole meeting. Before we dive into that research and put forward those options, I know this impacts the area directors electoral areas the most. Wanted to bring this up for some discussion and feedback from you guys before we dive in from a staff perspective, dive into that report. So I guess the first thing to put out there is, and I'll give you some ideas on this and then I'll put it back to the chair to facilitate the discussion, is how should it be funded? So if we want to go down that road, like I said, currently there's no mechanism, there's no pot of funding that we can access. So some of the options to consider are, I mean, the first and more straightforward one would be to amend our existing policy and allow the EA grant and aid funding, the discretionary funding, to be used for that purpose. So just to remind you, the way that program works is essentially the discretion of the area director to allocate funding as they see fit. That would mean in that scenario, it'd be a year by year request and year by year discretion of the individual director of how that looks. So if I put on a hat pretending I'm one of these emergency response groups, I'm not guaranteed that funding. I have to ask for it every year, and depending on the area director relationship with them, whether I get it or not. The other option, if we want to look at some sort of longer term stable funding model, is a service establishment where we actually have a service set up specifically for that. So that could look differently. We could have a regional service establishment where all electoral areas and all municipalities pay into one pot of funding, and then there's grant and aids distributed through that funding pot, or some sort of sub-regional service, perhaps just the electoral areas pay into it and not the municipalities, or an EA specific service where each EA would either choose to establish a service or not, and then the funding from the EA stays within that EA. So I think I threw that out there. Maybe I'll stop here. I have a few other questions to move on, but I think this is a good discussion point around to get some feedback from this committee.
And just one other point, if I could add, is we probably would have to go back and get just another legal opinion just to make sure that we're completely covered with respect to providing funding from the TNRD organization to brigades or volunteer societies.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Scott. And to add to that, which we'll include in the report, that the model would be, and I should be crystal clear on this, is that the funding would be a grant and aid style model where we're not being involved in the operation. It's just an assistance grant and aid, but tied to that would be a funding agreement that specifies what the funding is for and what it's not for. And we would also include, again, I don't have all of this worked out yet, but we would only allow funding for specific equipment, for example, that's used for this type of response. So for example, it wouldn't fund a new ladder truck for fighting structural fires, because that's not the intent of it. So we'll still need to draw that line that this is specific for wildfire response type of work under the direction of BC Wildfire, because I recognize that some of the groups here are only interested in doing wildfire response, like you heard from the Knutsford group, but some of the groups would also be fire brigades that are society-run fire departments that are planning, do and will continue to plan to respond to structural fires through their own society that's completely independent of the TNRD. And we don't want to cross those paths and muddy that water that we're now backtracking and funding structural fire protection when the board already made a decision and through a legal opinion that we shouldn't go down that road. But we think, what Scott and I've talked about this, we think we can get to a point where we can draw that line and make that very clear. But I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Just one question right now. It doesn't matter what pot of money we take it out of, we can only give to societies. Have you looked at how we would give funding and also it was a societies? Because from what I understand, to start a new society, it's fairly complicated these days. Is that where we'd get legal opinion?
Go ahead, Jamie. But
yeah, I mean, that is something we could look at, but I'll be honest, the similar to our other funding mechanisms, we would expect it to be through a society. We wouldn't be giving money to individuals. That causes a whole bunch of complications, even from the Local Government Act point of view of funding individual businesses or people.
Just from an accounting standpoint and the forensic audit coming out of that, it needs to be a society.
Okay. Maybe considerations with Wildfire BC if they actually, I guess you need the funding ahead of time so you have the equipment in place. And I'll open up to the other directors. Director Smith.
So in the case of 70 Mile House, for instance, I see this being an issue right off the bat because they're going to probably jump on this bandwagon as far as trying to get hooked up with BC Wildfire for a specific wildfire event. So are you prepared for that sort of scenario or?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I shouldn't say we're prepared for it, but we're thinking about that. And that's where Scott was mentioning we're going to kind of dig into this a little more from a legal point of view of, can we, if we have a program where we're providing grant and aid for equipment related to wildfire response and that group goes and uses it for something else, what does that look like? How much does that come back to us? I mean, all what's tied into here, and you'll see I have a question on the next slide, it's ultimately the board needs to decide at what level of risk or liability risk is the board willing to take on this program and what can we do to minimize that. But I think you hit the nail on the head that we need to be prepared that there is the serious risk, or in reality, there's going to be organizations who will want to be part of this program, who will also be using the equipment for things other than wildfire.
Well, I'll give you a scenario. They during the Elephant Hill fire, for instance, they obtained a bunch of funding because they were protecting Chasm Mill and all the rest of it. So they bought a structure protection trailer, but it's not finished yet, or it's finished, but it doesn't have the approved equipment in it to be able to rent it out for wildfire response. So I can tell you right now that that's where they'd focus in on trying to get extra money so that they could outfit that. And now is that something that would be a scenario, or like, I mean, having an SBU trailer is a pretty good revenue generator during a fire if you have a completely accepted and properly equipped trailer. So if they don't, would they be able to use funding to equip that trailer properly then?
I think if I could add, I think the clear definition would be structural and non-structural. If they're using the funding towards structural protection, we don't want any part of it because we have significant liability with that. All we want to help fund is non-structural BC wildfire related support is really, and that's where we have to draw that line. And they would need to sign off on that liability.
So any requests from BC Wildfire, then if they did get involved with being a response team, would not have anything to do with SBU then? Because BC Wildfire does SBU.
Yeah, right? So that's the complexity around this one. So BC Wildfire might reach out to them to provide a different service that we're not responsible for.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're right. It's going to be blurry, but we need to try to make it as clear as we absolutely can.
Thank you. Director Sal, and then Director Thorpe, and Director Hooton, and Director Hayworth.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the funding model of a new service establishment, is that going to be a referendum or is it just going to be a board vote? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, if it's a new service establishment, there would need to be public assent. That'll be a discussion at the committee of the whole meeting, depending on what it looks like. So just a quick reminder, there's the referendum, then there's the counter petition option or a petition. So depending on the budget and the impact, this may be a candidate for the alternate approval process or what it's often called the counter petition. But to clearly answer the question, no, it's not just a board vote. It needs public assent one way or the other.
Director Thorpe.
Thank you. Okay, so I've been thinking about this one for a while. One of the things I would look at is I think discretionary funding will not pay for it. We're capped at 13.5, and those courses cost about $400 a piece. So I think we do need to look at some sort of alternate funding, having a new funding stream for that. In terms of it having to go through a society, at first I didn't think that that was the greatest idea, but then I started thinking about it, and I think we need to have accountability. So we do need to do that society. If there's a way of maybe making the societies easier, or having communities come together and do a blanket society across an area, maybe that might be an option. Just trying to think outside the box a little bit there, because it is onerous on some people and they're not willing to do it. In terms of equipment and who should be covered, I think that this is a kind of a regional one. Most of the community, like the little villages and cities, they all have fire departments, and they're funded through their communities. So that's separate, I think. And I think it's the rural that really needs the wildfire assistance, because we have nothing out there. And I think it would be great and to have the equipment. So I think we need to look at it. Those are my opinions anyway.
Scott?
Just on that, on those comments, I just wanted to add too, I agree with what you're saying. I think when Jamie laid out the options, we don't make the decision as staff. We want to lay out all the options, but I would think this would be an EA sub-regional type approach, because the municipalities do this and they tax their residents specifically for this. So I think this will be up to the 10 EAs to potentially fund, and that would be then taxed to the residents of the electoral areas.
Director Hooton.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Jamie, can you go back to the slide of the 9 different groups that applied? Went by that pretty quick. Turtle Valley, Nuts for yeah, there it is. Kelly Lake, Upper Clever. Quite a range of different areas there. Thank you. Is there any way we can amend the community building fund? I know it's not technically designed for that, but work with UBCM and the Government of Canada to use some of our funding that's sitting there to use that instead of creating a new fund, or is that a waste of time?
Yeah, it's very restrictive because that funding comes out of the federal government through the province to us, and how we need to report on it and be held accountable to would be very difficult to use that funding from my experience. Yeah.
Director Hayward.
Okay, some of my questions got answered. So if we do this, and we would say fire brigades or whatever, does the TNRD carry the insurance on these individuals, or do they have to get their own insurance through their own society?
I don't know. So it wouldn't be TNRD. I don't know the insurance requirement that BC Wildfire would have. The way I understand it is that when they are hired on as a stat hire, they become essentially a contracted employee. The society and their members become contracted employees. So then they're covered from a liability insurance point of view, safety program, and the direction of BC Wildfire. So that's the mechanism. So what's changed now is BC Wildfire has kind of opened the door to saying, if you have these minimum requirements and you are within the impacted community and have basic training and equipment, then we'll consider hiring you if needed for specific tasks.
Okay.
Just if I could add to that, Jill, sorry, Director Haywood. It was also one of the task force recommendations is that BC Wildfire work much closely with community groups and societies. So that's where we're kind of pushing this from. So there could be other funding from the province at some point. we're just trying to get ahead of it, given the nature of what's going on. And really the differentiation, I think, for the societies is when BC Wildfire says, okay, we need your help, and they contract you, to Jamie's point, there would be full liability and insurance and that kind of thing. When they do their day-to-day things and aren't necessarily contracted is when they would need their own insurance.
Their own insurance. Okay. So on that theme, we've already seen these fire brigades coming up, especially like in my area, Area O, because we don't have fire departments that can go out to those areas. So it's really a positive for the electoral areas, I would think. And it's proving that it's worthwhile. So from my point of view, I think it's a really good idea if you can make it work, and if it can be funded, I think it's super.
Director Thorpe.
Just a quick question, back to the 9 groups that were able to use the BC wildfire. How were those 9 groups chosen? Because selfishly, Area I has several societies that would absolutely have loved to have been part of this, but who was contacted and how? Do we know?
From my understanding, I believe they reached out to BC Wildfire directly. This is not something that we organized, or they used our room and our space here but they were the society reached out directly. Jamie, am I right?
Yeah, I don't know the details other than that Wildfire worked through Fraser Basin Council, and they reached out to all known groups, and there was more than this contacted. These are the ones who confirmed and received the benefit. I can't speak to anyone else who may apply. It wasn't through us. We were kind of we were aware that it was happening, but no one really.
Because I wasn't really aware that any of my groups could do this.
Yeah, nor were we. So I think it's still open though.
I'm thinking, how do we raise awareness so that we can get our groups involved in this? Or how do we reach out to Fraser Basin and make sure that they're communicating with us so we can in turn communicate to our residents?
Yeah, and that's something we could help connect the dots on now that, we're more aware that this is happening. And I could find out, because I know there was more than this they attempted to contact or attempted to reach out to, and it just didn't happen, or they weren't interested, didn't have enough people interested in actually taking advantage of it. It was a very tight window that they were working with. I think Wildfire threw some money at this, saying, find as many as you can, set up the training. And I think the funding expires at the end of June to do this as a 1 year. But I think understanding that there's maybe some that are left out of this. The fact that there's that many on this very short turnaround pilot project in the TNRD, I would see as a positive. Yeah.
Okay, because actually through First Nations, I managed to get a couple of people trained, but it wasn't through this, and it was just by having a contact.
Director Morris.
Thank you. So just maybe a simple question, but probably not. Is there a way? So what we're talking about is a lot of volunteer organizations in small rural areas coming together on this particular project. Could we, as TNRD, without putting ourselves in the middle of a liability sort of responsibility, but could we assist them in terms of finding some level of group coverage, group terms of references, those kinds of things, and essentially try and find an insurance approach that keeps some of their costs down as well, and gives us some possibly consistency between some of these various and sundry groups. I'm just trying to, otherwise you've got all these the volunteers running around trying to figure out who they can get insurance from, who's going to do it, and that kind of thing. So just to make it a little easier for them, but save us harmless, as it were.
Just one thought that I had, and Jamie, please jump in, is when Knutsford was here, I can't remember the gentleman's name off the top of my head. Yeah, Mr. Peterson and the group really spoke a lot about that, and he was willing to actually reach out. I think they've done 90% of the work already. So just reaching out to them, or having that society reach out to them, I think is your best bet. If we needed to get involved in that, there's also, now we're involved. So there's a liability associated with that, potentially.
Okay, so supplemented to that, example being Terry Jessup was here.
Yeah, that's the name.
And spoke, yeah,
Thank you.
Terry.
Yeah.
And spoke obviously on a fairly so are we leading ourselves as TNRD directors down a road that we really shouldn't, we can't be on, or we're meeting quietly and trying to work together with the concept that Terry has put forward? Is that an option for us as well?
Jamie, I think so.
Yeah. I think, and maybe to back up a bit to just clarify the model is what essentially we're looking at is we're going to call it a grant and aid, very similar in operation to how our search and rescue grant and aid works. So we have an existing regional search and rescue program. There's society-run independent search and rescue organizations that have other funding that they're fully, a society that's run by their board of directors, and we provide funding, operational funding and equipment funding towards them to the search and rescue groups. So that's the model we're looking at. We have no direct operational involvement. So, and that's what, spoiler alert, that's what we'll be recommending, is that we don't get involved in the nitty gritty of helping them create a society and figure that stuff out. It's if they have the capacity and desire to do that on their own, how do we fund that? Which Nuts, for example, prove that they have the ability, drive, desire to do that. Are there still going to be people that say, well, I just want you to give money to buy a pump for the back of my truck so I can run out and chase a fire? Yes, that those people will be upset because they'll still want us to fund that. But I can tell you that our recommendation is that we wouldn't go down that road. To circle back on your other question about insurance, and forgive me if I'm wrong, I think what you're getting at is insurance challenges that some fire brigades are having who actually are society that do structural fire protection, and they can't get insurance or can't afford insurance. And that's because they're doing structural fire protection. So a society having CGL insurance for just being a society, I don't think that's going to be a roadblock for them. But I think what you're hearing about is organizations who are doing structural fire protection who can't get insurance or can't afford insurance because of the high risk and high liability, which loops into, that's why the board has established the policy the way it did 6 or 7 years ago. And we're not recommending that we change direction on that. So again, that line we need to think about. Leave it at that.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that, if I may. That was good clarification, Jamie. Thank you. And we just want a very coordinated and organized approach so that we are all on the same page and to help as much as we can without kind of crossing that liability line. So, yeah.
Director Ansel.
Thank you. My question is, what's the actual value that we're thinking about, even just preliminary? Like, how much money are we talking? Is it hundreds of thousands or millions?
Can you put on the next slide, Justin, please? Or back to the slideshow. I don't have a number there, but that was just one of the questions. So these are this is my last slide, that these are more open-ended questions, not that we need an answer, but this is something to consider because we're talking about taxation and potentially a new service. Okay, well, what are we talking about for budget? What do we think is reasonable for grant and aid, let's say within an electoral area or region-wide? Do we have $100,000 region-wide that's available every year that societies apply for? Or is it 200,000 or is it 50,000? Ultimately, we know the ask is, the more the better from these groups, but at the end of the day, it's direct taxation to the electoral areas. So I don't have a number in mind. We're going to do some more research into this around equipment and what's reasonable, but I think that's a good question to put to your colleagues here.
I think you're on the right track though, Director. I believe that a couple $100,000 would be a good starting point. And then we need to just determine from there, that's 20,000 per EA. And if you kind of average that out, it's probably quite a small number per resident. And that might be just a place to start to see what the intake's like and the value and continue to just adjust it. We just need to get to that point.
One other thing that I see in my area specifically is we have such a small population base. So potentially there wouldn't be the volunteers that would be willing to take on something like this. And so I would just need to better understand if it's region-wide taxation and then your EA doesn't have anybody or any groups that are capable of doing this service, then do you opt out of it, or is it for the betterment of the whole TNRD? Like,
I think it's a bit of both, but I liked what Director Thorpe was talking about. There could be a sub-regional approach where electoral areas A and B, perhaps in that group, you can build a society for both. And I know it's a distance away, but that might be the approach to do it, where there is collaboration that way.
I was wondering, just a thought, if Knutsford could lay out the structure of their society and how they've got it put together, just so they seem to be a well-organized functioning group. And if you could get the structure that they've used, like to put in and address what it's going to be required to have a society, that might help, because they've already done all the work on that, and that would be a template of what you need to do.
Yeah, they presented that full strategy here. And so are you asking just to try to get a copy of that presentation? Because I think, is it part of the minutes, or do we need to request that from, we can simply get that from him and share that and share the contact information. If that maybe is a follow-up, then it's Terry, right? We can have Terry's contact along with the presentation. It could be, it could be Gordon Peterson too, but we can certainly get that if that's what the board's asking for.
And that would give an idea of the structure of the society they have to put together. Just a thought on funding. There might be areas, as Director Onslow says, where there are no volunteers or no groups that want to participate in your area. I think that's something we have to look at. And I do like the idea of partnering between different area directors to provide that kind of funding. It seems to work quite well. Any other discussion?
Does this seem like a good idea? It sounds like it. I think we know the path forward, but of course, the EA committee and the board need to make the decision. So I think we've heard loud and clear from all EAs individually and as a group that I think we need to move forward to just, so we're prepared to bring that information to the committee of the whole in July.
Director Houghton, you had
just a comment on your request, Sir Scott. I think as a group, we should somehow proceed with this as 10 EAs and get this thing going. I think very important for all of us in the times we're in. Just have to look outside the back door, and we're going to need those services probably sooner than later. So if we could get working on the structure, I think it'd be great for all of us. Thank you.
That's the consensus. I mean, that would be the recommendation. So that's really the purpose of this discussion today, is we thought we knew where you guys wanted to go, and I think we hit the nail on the head. So thank you. Well, we're going to have a roundtable session now, and talking to some of the directors. They have been, Herb and I are quite fortunate. We do not have a water utility in our areas, so we don't get the same pressure and questioning as to why my water bill went up $10 a month, which fortunately they don't seem to relate to the value of water. So maybe Jim, do you want to start it off, what you're dealing with? And we'll just go, if any of the directors have any comments, just let me know and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I feel probably a little bit uninformed, and it's probably my own fault because I'm not sure, just all of the chemical intricacies that cause water problems. And I'm sure Tyrone could fill me in on that. But we did sit, as Doug says, and we made the hard decisions to try and get some money into the system to look after this stuff. But it's starting to bubble to the surface now. And I got approached yesterday by a resident at Loon Lake that has been on boil water for 2 years. So putting through a price increase really kind of rubbed them the wrong way. And I don't have any answers for them. So all I'm looking for is some clarity going forward, some sort of a strategy if we have one, as far as dealing with the worst systems first or whatever. I'm just not so sure. But I think we got to have, for me to side with her and say, I understand your frustration, but I don't have any real concrete information to give her, so that's kind of what I'm looking for.
Go ahead. You have a comment, Jamie?
Yeah, thanks. And Director Smith and I had a chat about this offline before the meeting as well. So a couple things there. Yeah, if you're as a director, you want more kind of better technical understanding of your system in your area or systems in your area. They all have issues, but they all have different issues. So happy to set up a meeting where we can sit down and walk through the details of it honestly, with Tyrone and Mick, who are experts on it more so than myself. And we've done that with a few of the directors in previous years as well. So that to help you understand the intricacies of each system, because yeah, they're all very different and different challenges. And more of a general comment to the whole committee here. I know there was a lot to unpack about the considerations and the recommendations or the options for the rate increases. If you want to refamiliarize yourself, I'll just remind you that whole meeting is on our YouTube channel. So Tyrone did a really good job of putting that presentation together and the report. So I can circulate that to this committee. Just, when you have trouble falling asleep, you can read up on water systems and remember. But I'll give you the very short message that's not the easiest message to deliver, but the rate increases were related, the recommended rate increases or the options, which they were all increased but by different amounts, were based on having funding available to fix this existing system when it breaks or when it fails. So even though there's an increase in rates, I want to remind everyone to be careful that these rates aren't promising that everyone's going to have better water. It's promising that the water that's flowing through the pipes now, essentially in the condition it's coming through now, will continue to be able to flow through when things break, so we can afford to replace that pump. The entire crew is at Savinaw right now pulling the whole pump out of the water because the pump failed yesterday. So those are kind of big costs that pop up, and we had enough funding to have a replacement pump sitting in our shop or in Savinaw that they're able to replace. Some systems, we don't even, we hardly have the money for that. We do have those pumps, I think, for every system, but, we might have to wait a year until we have enough money to buy another replacement part to sit on the shelf. That's how close we are with all of these systems, and that's what these are related to. So I totally appreciate the concerns that Director Smith is hearing, saying, you're increasing my rates and I'm still on boil water. With that system, yes, there's going to stay on boil water in Loon Lake unless we have significant grant funding to change the system. But in that situation, the rates still need to be increased so we can fix other stuff when it breaks, so people can still at least turn on their tap and get water to boil or have a shower or irrigate the lawn, etc.
So there's no contingency plan right now to deal with areas that are on boil water. In other words, if you're on it now, you could be on it forever. So all you're paying for is water that you use other than potable.
So I think that's where we need to dive into each system. Yes, there's options and a long-term strategy of what would be done next in each system, but those aren't funded. So that capital costs aren't funded. Now with Loon Lake specifically, it's if we dive into that, you look at the numbers and it's impossible to justify a filtration plant that would remove the boil water. So we're looking at other options like water fill stations for potable water, a smaller scale treatment system in that location. And then switching gears to somewhere like Pritchard, we were fortunate enough, because that's one of the biggest systems, fortunate enough to get a grant to put in a filtration system that will eventually get them off boil water when that's done in a year and a half, 2 years' time.
Jamie, I just have a question on how much is IHA involved in our water systems? We have certain levels of criteria that we have to meet for each different water district?
Yes. So IH is the police. They set the rules. We follow. They set the regulations that we need to follow. So when we put in a boil water notice or well quality advisory, it is because of the standards that they've set. And then the standards they've set for our systems to operate at is what the ultimate goal is, to have these systems operate at, which we've talked to the utilities committee quite a bit about those requirements and how we're in almost all the systems, we're not meeting those requirements because of the infrastructure that would be needed.
So it's the TNRD's responsibility to put in the boil orders in the different water districts?
Yes,
okay.
No, if it's a TNRD owned or operated system. So whoever is the operator of the water system is responsible to notify them and do the boil water notices, yes.
Okay. We're just sort of going to go around and see, and we'll get to you, Renee. We're just going to have each individual. Lee, did you have any questions around your water system?
Yeah, sure. So with the Blue River, we just had a community meeting, and that's the only water system that is in my electoral area. And people are obviously concerned about the cost increase that they're going to see, because it's a 55% price increase over 5 years. So it's significant. But the people that I spoke with, they were also very understanding of the fact that we do have to invest in our water system to be able to keep healthy drinking water coming to our houses. One of the concerns that people brought up is we are investing into our water system as other electoral areas are, but how do we decide who gets priority in the future? So if we build a kitty and the TNRD can look at our water system and say, okay, you guys, you're doing okay. You've got $300,000 sitting there. You can have a failure of sorts. But another water system has very little money sitting there. Would they get a priority over a significant repair that we might need as well through grant funding? And so that's something that people actually might pay attention to and want to watch. And I know I will as well, for sure, because we are paying and we're investing into that system. And if another area gets a grant and they've not invested into their water systems at the level that we have, then it would be contentious and cause a problem. So that's how I feel.
And I can respond to that. It's a very good question, and it's not a straightforward answer because all grants are different. So anytime a grant opportunity comes up, we're going to evaluate it and look at it from a staff perspective and then make a recommendation. So, and all the grant applications need to be approved by the board. So each and every time we do that, that's a decision of the board of how to prioritize that. But just to give a few scenarios, for example, if one water system has a good reserve fund, another one doesn't, often grants are funded, let's say it's a 2/3 funded grant. So the community that has enough money in the reserve to fund 1/3 of the project, it's an easier sell to prioritize that for the grant application than a system that doesn't have money. The other often case that comes up is the maximum amount of the grant. So a water treatment plant in Savinaw is $10 million. So if a grant is 100% funded for a project up to $1 million, well, Savinaw's not going to be eligible for that. So we're going to be looking at what other ones would fit within that box. Sometimes it's only one or two projects fit within that box. So it's a fairly easy thing, but sometimes it may be many. It's not always an easy decision, but to give you comfort, that's a decision of the board always of who actually, what the grant is applied for.
Director Morris, did you have any comments about your water system? Or you're good? Okay. Director Thorpe, you had any questions? Okay, your turn.
Jamie, the increase in the Savinaw water system, is it going to reserve funds?
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm trying not to criticize, but the people do not understand that because they think that it's costing more to run the system. And both Michael and I have told them, no, it's not. So then why do they have to pay more money? And I guess it's just because either him or I have not actually got across to them that this is a reserve fund increase. And maybe you need to take a look at that, because I mean, if pumps go, that's a big issue. And we're looking, I think Michael has applied, I don't know, for the water treatment plant for a grant. I don't know whether he has or not, but if he hasn't, he should. I will tell him that, because that system, and the more people we have there, the we're growing. That water system is getting to the point where it's going to need some big time help, would be my guess. So just wanted to suggest that might be the case.
Thanks for that, Director Elliott. One comment that I'd like to make, because he raised it, and it was a good point. We're trying hard to communicate that the increased revenue we're going to receive from increased rates. Two things: we want to make sure people understand it stays within that service, so it doesn't go to some slush fund somewhere else. It can't be used to build a dock somewhere across the lake. It's for the water system. And Colton's done an excellent job on our newsletters, and what we're going to do, which we started this spring, is every single newsletter that's specific, so newsletter specific to utility system, is going to include what the reserve fund is, so people can see that as essentially this is the bank account of this system, and they can see it growing. Or if there's an expense, like a significant expense, we could highlight that as we had to use reserve funds to fix this pump that broke, so they see that money in action.
Thank you. I mean, I know when we started that, when we got going with that, it was a big expense, but having it actually is my pet peeve on pet, that water system being the biggest has got to be the most expensive. And I think that I have got across, and I'm sure Michael has got across, that we know that the money stays in the Savino system. I think everybody does know that. But the increase that happened, I think it's just this year. They don't understand what happened, that their cost of maintenance went up. And I guess it's because the cost of maintenance didn't go up. So that would be appreciated if you could get that across.
Director Houghton, you have a comment on your water systems?
I just like to say, Director Graham and Director Laird, you come out of these smelling like roses because you got no water systems. But
we do have a large water system in Lower Nicola, and I've talked to them, and they say we never want to go near the TNRD, so they just keep suffering along, and they tell IHA that we can't do that, and so far IHA hasn't forced them to do the things that are required. So yeah, it's good that they're dealing with it, not us.
Yeah, I agree. But there's so many different types of water systems and size of water systems, what we learned at that utilities meeting. And the hardest ones, like in Del Oro, even though there was a very nice letter that Colton sent out and very good press release, and that was fantastic. It was very explicit on where this funding's going. I think if they had potable water versus quantity of water, if we could get water that is delivered to their doorstep that is passable, if I want to use that term. I think you take like mine's, a user group of 43. Well, you can't go put in a huge filtration system and, state-of-the-art thing for 43 households. But we've got to be able to find some funding somewhere that's eligible. And I know Jamie and I have talked about the yellow box deal that Tyrone gave us the idea of that would work for 43, but then there's funding restraints. We can't get funding for this here. We can't get it there, but something like that's not going to cost the world. If somehow we could get through to get the funding so we could put these little, I call them yellow boxes in, if that would help bring them better quality of water, I think they would appreciate what we're trying to do. And I know it was very explicit where the money's going on the rate increase, but it seems like every time we turn around, we're hitting a brick wall on funding. Thank you.
Director Hayward, you had some comments?
Yeah, Maple Mission is our water system in Area O. And we had to come up with a huge jump for those folks. They've jumped up like $250 a month almost, which is hard to take, but they do have potable water and a running system. I think the hard part for the folks who are the users is to truly understand the cost of the systems, running the systems, the maintenance of the systems, and protecting that system into the future. If they don't have the system, they don't have water. And that's a hard one to get across to people. You know, it immediately is, this is a huge jump, how do we pay for it? But if you don't have that water system, how much does it cost to bring water in? How much does it cost to look at other options? It's a hard sell. It's the right sell, but it's a hard sell. And it's very hard as a regional director to have to go to folks and say, this is how it is because we're protecting your future and where you're going and you have water. So it's not pleasant for a regional director to have to deal with that, but I hope that folks that I have talked to are starting to understand that it's really protecting your future with a good water system where you live. That's all I got to say.
Okay. The one thing that we don't look at is when we put in these filter systems to improve the quality of the water, the amount of water that's actually used in your household that requires good quality water is very small. Usually it's irrigating your gardens and your lawns. And I know this when I was at the city of Merritt, when the winter came, we went, the water usage in the whole community dropped by 2/3. So as soon as it's summertime, we have a 2/3 increase in the flow of water. And people don't seem to understand that it's very expensive to deliver water to keep your lawn green year round. If you look in the lower mainland, where it rains all the time, you go down there in August and you wouldn't, everybody has a brown lawn because they can't afford to water because they're all on meters. And we're lucky that all of our regional district systems are on a meter. And that's how you control the volume of water that's used. Just another suggestion. I know I put in a filtered water system strictly for drinking purposes, and it's a separate system that the water flows through, and you have one tap at your kitchen sink that gives you good quality drinking water. It was about $1,000 to install. And with our system, you have to change the filters about 3 times a year. So it's $100 to change out the filters, but you only do that 3 times a year and you get really good quality drinking water. What really depends is on the type of chemicals that you're trying to remove from the water to make it potable. So I don't know if anybody's considered putting in an individual filter system, but it is a way of getting quality water. But in your case, Jim, I think you'd have to have the water tested to see what kind of filters you need. Because some of them are very expensive depending on what you're taking out. Go ahead, Scott.
Thank you, Chair. I know Roundtable will continue. I just want to, from a efficiency standpoint, I know Alex and Tony are here regarding planning or ALR topics. So would it be possible to maybe have those questions come up now so that they can go and get back to work? If that's possible, just.
Certainly. I didn't know we had somebody waiting.
No, not a problem. I just wanted to be efficient with the time because I know.
Yeah, are we finished with the water? Do the directors feel that they've got enough information they can take it back to their different water districts and explain what's going on, or do they need some more information? Yeah. So I guess if you have any questions about your quality of water or anything like that, Tyrone would be the person to talk to. Okay, if there's no other questions, who was next, Scott, that's coming in?
If there was any questions on the roundtable regarding anything to do with planning or development, Tony and Alex are here to answer any questions.
I don't know if go ahead, Director Onslow.
I'll just bring up for the group that recently Alex and I had a meeting with a person who canceled their build up in Blue River. And one of my main takeaways from that meeting is that the building code is making it very challenging for rural communities, or it will make it challenging for these rural communities to meet the code because of getting the professionals to come up. So that's one takeaway. And I think an advocacy that many regional districts and rural communities will have to face with the provincial government coming up in the future. And then the other thing that came out of that meeting is how approachable our planning and building department actually is. And if ever anyone in my area starts talking about building, my very first suggestion is going to be open your phone and have a conversation and come down to the office, because I feel that in our situation, things would have gone differently had the person who is proposing to build had those conversations, and they are very willing to work with people. And that's the message as the electoral area director that needs to be conveyed to the constituents. Because I think the perception right now is the TNRD is hard to deal with. That's up in Blue River. And that's something that can be changed through conversation with people and opening the communication line. So thank you very much. You did a great job.
Director Smith, you had a question?
Yeah, for Alex, we had a very brief conversation about this information that's flowing around about the ALR regulations or taxation or whatever it is that's coming in. I've read the one that came out in the Lower Mainland, and I'm not really up on it, but it's already starting to hit the airwaves, and I'd like to nip it in the bud if for sure none of that information is going to affect any of the properties in the TNRD.
Yes, thank you for the question through the chair. So Director Smith sent some information here that we looked into further. So what happened was at the Lower Mainland Local Government Association convention recently, City of Pitt Meadows put forward 3 motions that were all passed. So these are resolutions that I understand are now going forward to UBCM. And I'll just check my notes here. So the 3 pieces were: 1, unfarmed land tax. So they want to bring in a tax on ALR land. And if it's not being farmed, that it gets this extra taxation to try to discourage speculation. The second one they're bringing in or recommending is a School Act exemption, and they want to remove the 50% school tax exemption for vacant land in the ALR. So right now, all ALR land, whether it's used or not, gets a 50% break on the school tax component. They want to strip that. Then the third resolution was to increase the threshold required to get farm status. So the farm income that's required, they want to make it more difficult to get farm status. And they're saying that all of these recommendations are to support agriculture. So this was the first I had heard of it. It's certainly not coming from any rural areas. It was brought forward by City of Pitt Meadows. So I think the concern, by the looks of some of the emails you sent me from your residents, it's basically a question of, will the TNRD be advocating against this? Because this will have a serious impact on rural TNRD residents. And I don't think the issues that we deal with and that our residents deal with are the same as the City of Pitt Meadows. So I understand these are coming forward to UBCM, and so you'll probably see them there. And the question now is, do you want to advocate or do something to speak against this idea?
Any other questions from directors about planning or? Yeah, let's go. Director Morris.
Thank you. Very simple. Also, it's recently sounding confusing a bit about AF1 as well. And I'm just curious if there's any further on that. So we can chat about it separately, but I started to hear a little bit more on that front too.
Alex, if they're gonna try and send this to UBCM, obviously would be on our part, we should be advocating against it. But one of the things that I read about ALR land that's not in ALR, like not in production or whatever. If they double the taxes on that land because it's not in production, are they going to take into consideration the land? Because if you took my 20 acres has no water. Okay, so I can't farm it. And even the soil is, I mean, I could probably make get gravel pit out of it, but that's about all it's good for. But I can't get it out of the ALR. And it's good for housing, it's not good for farming. So if they double my taxes and my whole area around Cherry Creek is basically the same, how are we going to advocate against that?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I know I can jump into. I know that we heard you loud and clear, and I know Corbin's got that from on the list as far as taking that to this afternoon's meeting for the board, and hopefully that'll be something the board wants to get behind for UBCM. But yeah, the advocacy part will be important for all of you as well as the regional district as a whole. So staff are certainly behind you on that. We just need to know if the board wants us to push that forward.
And maybe I'll just add to that, if I may. This is partly tied to some of the discussions we've had in the last few weeks and certainly the last EA directors meeting, which is this whole notice of intent and some of the changes in how the ALR is interpreting the regulations. That's also making it very difficult on residents who are in the ALR. So we have that. And one of the pieces to that was that a lot of properties are in the ALR that shouldn't be in the ALR. And so from a staff perspective, I've always thought, why don't they deal with that first? Right. So some of these changes will be impacting, lakefront lots at Green Lake. One of the challenges is when we brought this up at the ALCs, they said, well, as local government, you can make a request to do a block exclusion. So you can take a neighborhood and say, okay, this neighborhood doesn't want to be in anymore, and you can bring that forward. They didn't say they'd approve it. They said you could bring it forward. So they want the local government to do the process, do the work, upset or stir up the neighborhood. And one of the challenges with that, and we tried something similar in Whitecroft about, let's call it 10 years ago. Residents then picked up on the fact that they would lose the School Act exemption. And so then they said, we actually want to remain in the ALR. And so it's a bit of a tricky one where we have people in the ALR wishing they weren't in the ALR, and we have people in the ALR who are happy with the little bit of tax exemption that they get now, which if that's removed, will obviously change things again. But fundamentally, I think another push that the board can do is to say, can the ALR relook at its boundaries and try to get that straight first before we're looking at more regulation or more taxation?
Director Hooton and then Director Hayward.
Thank you, Director. Two things. Thanks, Alex, about the work that you did with the Deputy Assistant Minister of Agriculture last week. I thought it was a good meeting. I forgot to mention Chair Roden attended that one by Zoom, but I thought we brought some of these things to their attention then, and hopefully I think we got to the right person there. I think the upper politicians, I'm not picking on the ag minister, she's new at the game. I think this lady knows what's really going on and can, look after our efforts. But as far as what Pitt Meadows is trying to do, I think you have to understand what is the definition of agricultural land. And, what they do in Pitt Meadows in the Fraser Valley or the Okanagan is different from what we do in the Nicola Valley or Knutsford or Cherry Creek, like Director Elliott said. The land's only capable of doing what the land can do. We can't pump water for miles just to say we got to irrigate it or plow it. Or the preservation of our grasslands for our ecosystem, our livestock is just as important, more important up here than it is down in the Fraser Valley. So I think before you make all these different changes, I think we have to look at the capability, what the land is physically capable of doing, because land is different in various areas of the province. You go up north, it's grain land, it's crop. You go down our highway where we're going to go to Merritt for our out of town meeting, grassland capital of BC, and they've all got their place. God put them all there for a reason. So I think we really got to look at the structure of the land and what it's capable of doing. Just because you can't stick a plow in the ground, that doesn't mean it's not good agricultural land. But that's just as important to preserve that as Pitt Meadows' beautiful soil. Thank you.
Director Hayward.
I agree with a whole lot of what everybody said here, but I think one of the points is the fact that this is coming from Pitt Meadows, which is a huge, massive population. And they are looking for places to build houses. And they're seeing empty fields with nothing happening on them. And that's what they're looking for. It's an expansion of where do we put all the people? Unfortunately, that overflows into the agricultural end of things. So I think that we're right on the fact that we need to look at our own zoning before we start saying that this is even doable, because as a farmer, we have fields that sit and do nothing sometimes for many years. Sometimes they need a rest. Sometimes we don't have the water. Sometimes our crop isn't going to make enough money to be worthwhile growing for the year, but in the next 2 years, it might go crazy. We might make a lot of money on it. So there's so many viables, but I think for a group that lives in the center of humanity, basically, in our province, to come forward with what we should do with our agricultural land is pretty sad.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe, yeah, through the chair, just adding to what Director Houghton said as well. Whether it's regulation from ALR, whether it's this tax idea from Pitt Meadows, it's constantly looking at a one size fits all for the entire province. And I think that's the theme here is maybe this is a good idea for Pitt Meadows, maybe, but not everywhere. And I think it's the same with the ALR regulations. The same regulations that apply in Richmond apply in rural TNRD and up north. So maybe another push would be to say, start to look at different areas and develop regulations that fit within the geography and the landscape that you're working in, not just the carpet across the whole province.
Is this something that we could advocate for to the LR? It sounds, listening to the members around the board, I think we could put that into a resolution.
And if I may, it is on the list, absolutely, and we'll make sure that it's brought up this afternoon to the board. But also just on the Pitt Meadows issue, this is only a resolution, and there's hundreds of resolutions that go forward to UBCM, and there's often little movement from the province on resolutions from UBCM. So, you know, while it is concerning, and I think there's a lot of great ideas that have gone around, it's not something that I think we need to panic fully about, because the province often doesn't move on UBCM resolutions. So
maybe it could be something we could talk to the agricultural minister about the concerns in the regional district that, you know, one size doesn't fit all that we've been dealing with. That would probably be better than a resolution. Just take it direct to the minister. Yeah. Director Elliott.
Well, I just was thinking that in the 1970s, they just went out in Victoria and draw a whole bunch of lines and said, this is ALR stuff. Over the last 35 years, how many times have they actually looked at ALR land within the province? Probably not very much. Where the lower mainland, because of its housing and its ability to feed the province, has ended up with us guys supposedly able to feed the province and them can build houses. And so I guess it's time that we advocated for them to take a look at better use of the land outside of the lower mainland, so that their new rules and regulations apply equally.
Okay, any other questions? Well, thanks very much for the discussion. It's kind of interesting to hear what goes on in our regional district. I'll continue with the roundtable. Anybody else has something to talk and bring up for roundtable? Trish?
This one is, it's a little bit delicate. There's been some issues lately. There was a letter that went to one of the municipalities that was not correct and said some things with regards to First Nations. And then yesterday, I had a phone call from somebody that was having some issues on their private land where there was somebody that showed up sort of unannounced, didn't really say what their purpose was, and with a lot of questioning, like pulling hen's teeth to quote them, it turned out that they were from archaeology, First Nations, and that they were there to look at a fire break from the 21 wildfire to see if there was any archaeology there. And there was an issue recently with, I think, one of our staff and a local First Nations chief, where I think, I don't know if the communication went breakdown or what happened, but somebody's feathers got ruffled. Recently, I did have one that went well. There was an issue with a question around a park, and I have a relationship with that particular band. And so the counselor reached out to me and we had a discussion, and a frank discussion, and everything was good. And I think what we really need to do is look at that cultural protection policy that we talked about and get that moving, because I think it would go a long way to working on these relationships, because everything seems to be, we're being very cautious, which we rightfully need to do, but we need to establish relationships, and we need to work on that cultural protection policy so that we're not stepping on toes. And I'd like to make a motion under new business that we look at moving forward with that cultural protection policy sooner rather than later. And if we need to, I know that the Caribou Regional District, hi, Steve, director from Caribou Regional District, they had a template started their draft that we could maybe use and get that forward, please. Did that all make sense?
Was that a motion? Do we have a seconder for the?
That was a motion.
Just for clarity, we have that motion already at the board level to move forward with that. I'm just not sure if what's different. I just want to know the difference.
I'm asking that we move forward with it sooner rather than later to make it a priority, please.
The other thing was around policy. I know I brought up the policy up yesterday at a policy meeting. We don't seem to have any sort of policy around how TNRD deals with the inclusion and collaboration. Because even the directors are now having a problem sorting that out. And I don't know how difficult it is to put a policy like that in place so that we understand where we sit and where staff sits and how the process is moving forward. Does that require a policy, or can we? I think it'd be easier if that was in place.
Thank you for the question. And through the chair, I think the problem we have is we have 25 First Nations that all look at inclusion and engagement 25 different ways. And we're learning that day in, day out with the ones that we're working on now, that some like staff working groups, some don't, some. So I know Corbin could speak to this, but I know the problem is one policy won't fit all, and it might put us in a corner.
Yeah, no, thank you. And just to add to that, and sort of going into the cultural protection policy as well, and I know it was discussed, and we've had some discussions at staff level about that. Our concern, like CAO Hildebrand mentioned, is that we don't want to try and create, we're talking about the ALR, how the province has tried to do a one size fits all. We don't want to do that either when it comes to First Nations relations, when it comes to a cultural protection policy, especially looking at best practices, wanting to make sure that we're providing ample opportunity for essentially free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to the policies that we're going to be implementing that are going to impact First Nations. And so these are ongoing discussions. And I don't know how it's going to look, especially around the cultural protection policy. It is one of those things that, it's on my list that I bring up when I'm meeting with staff of different communities. But what does that look like? Do we have 25 different cultural protection policies? Is it something that we include in our MOUs? Do they have something? Do the First Nations communities have a policy that we can use as a reference point when we're working in their territory? That sort of thing, right? So there's a lot of different factors that come into play, but the biggest thing is that we don't want to have a one size fits all approach to the policies that we're putting forward for Indigenous relations.
I do have a question. Do we have to get First Nations approval for any zoning change or building permits? I know the city of Merritt had to actually present each building permit that was being built in the city to the local First Nations, and they actually had to sign off on it. It was a very difficult thing for us to do. We finally had to put a timeline if they had to respond within 3 months, otherwise the permit would proceed. But we don't have anything at the regional district like that right now.
I'll start and I'll let Greg finish. We do with T-tests, for example, to Kamloops, we actually do a lot of referrals and connect and engage with them on a regular basis in and around Kamloops. But some of the other ones we do not. So Greg, I don't know if you have any kind of general feedback.
I just wanted to say from a statutory standpoint that although there's an increasing amount of voluntary consultation which is undergoing, because a lot of local governments now believe it's very important to engage our First Nations partners in development opportunities, the legislation that we follow under the Local Government Act doesn't have a position for First Nations consultation or consent in zoning bylaws. So they get, although there is always the possibility for engagement, and most municipalities, most regional districts will choose to engage with their neighboring First Nations when they're engaging in this, but there isn't, say, a statutory place in the process where a box has to be checked before things can proceed.
Thank you. And anything else? No,
just as a follow-up then on this, could we not reach out to the various groups? Because I do know that one size doesn't fit all, and say, look, this is what we're looking at doing. What would that look like to you? So at least we start the conversation and it looks like we're making an effort. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I'm trying to figure out a way to move this forward and to make sure that it isn't a one size all, but it shows that we are trying to do something and that we're wanting to engage and at least meet halfway.
Yeah, just to answer that, yes, but I think then we would, myself, as staff would need direction from the board, because my mandate currently is to draft legal agreements, right? So our protocol agreements are MOUs that we're currently drafting with a number of First Nations. And that's the approach we've been taking. And then policy changes or policy updates, or, you know, the using as an example, the cultural protection policy would be secondary to the MOUs, because that's sort of, I don't want to say it's a secondary priority because it is important, but my mandate for my job description is to draft agreements between the TNRD and local First Nations. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that I would need to know that the cultural protection policy instead is a priority above a legal agreement with the First Nations. I don't know if CAO Hildebrand has.
Or perhaps we can have that as a priority in the discussion around the MOU to start. Like when we go, unfortunately, if we were to send that out to 25 First Nations, we'd be engaging with 25 all at once, and there's only one of Corbin, so I'm not sure how we would manage that effectively without, I wouldn't want it to go badly. I would want to make sure that we're giving the time and attention. But I think each one we actually reach out to, maybe cultural protection is something that will be just one of the key topics as part of our MOU, perhaps. Yeah, and it always is, but we can make it more of a priority if that's.
That sounds very reasonable. We put that as part of our MOU. And I know I've lived with the First Nations my whole life, and we've never really recognized their importance of their cultural and spiritual areas within our communities. And we'll go in and take something out in a community that is it's a special area for the First Nations that live there. And there's no consultation, and we have no ideas with the way we're developing that we're actually interfering with their previous culture. So I think that idea of including it in the MOU is a great idea, and you're dealing with it one-on-one. Director Smith.
Question for Corbin. Are you dealing with tribal councils at all anymore, or is there that strategy within some of the bands? Because at one time there used to be a lot of tribal councils, I understand, but Is that some kind of going away? So there's not, you're, as Scott says, you're dealing with a whole bunch of smaller entities.
Yeah, no, thank you. Through the chair to Director Smith. No, there's tribal councils are not, so it's yes and no. To be direct. So yes, we want to work with tribal councils. Actually, the only MOU that we currently have is with the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council. That was signed, I think, well over a decade ago. But we know that the actual work and direction needs to come from individual communities. And so there's a lot of opportunities for us to work with tribal councils on larger projects or getting direction on some more high level things, because that's what tribal councils are able to deal with. But the actual on the ground work, then yeah, we still need to. It's not like we would have an MOU with the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council and then we wouldn't deal with any of the Secwepemc communities. We need to have both.
Any other questions from the directors over First Nations? For any other items for roundtable discussion? Well, that seems to be the end of our meeting. I guess we can adjourn. Moved in second. Thanks very much. I appreciated the conversations we had today, because it's not very often we can sit as a group and have such an open dialogue as to what's happening in our areas and what we're dealing with on a daily basis. So thanks very much for your participation.